do the same thing I did last time, which is I plan to take questions afterwards. So think about what questions you might have as I'm blathering away up here this morning. Last night, my family drove out to Dexter, the other side of Ann Arbor, to hear my brother play music on a farm. It was a perfect August thing to do. And we're driving back on I-94. It's late at night. And I look, and it had been rainy that day, and the weather had changed. It had become a beautiful day and evening. And I see the moon through the trees. And I'm just struck by it. And I start to talk about it. And I'm saying, Mom, did you see the beautiful moon right there? That's incredible. And then as we came up over a hill, it became clear that it actually was a Burger King sign. And that didn't rob me of that moment of joy as we were coming up on it. But those are the things that fill our lives too. I have a friend, one of my heroes, one of my saints, is a guy named Bob Darden. And Bob Darden is probably in 200 years of all the people I know, he's the one who will be the most significant. He loved black gospel music as a kid. And when he became a professor at Baylor, which is how I knew him, I was teaching there at the same time, he found out that basically that entire legacy was being lost, that it was all on vinyl rotting away in people's attics and basements. And as a journalism professor, what he did about that was he wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said, we're losing a great American legacy. And he heard from somebody, some financial services guy, said, I'll give you the money to save that legacy. And he did. And they set up a studio to digitize the records. Bob and his wife Mary drove all over the South, gathering up these records, and produced this incredible library. Now, one of the other things that Bob has brought to my life is an understanding of the role of humor in our faith. And I know that's not something we usually think of when we think of the Gospels. He wrote a book called Jesus Laughed. And it really was a remarkable book. And the thesis there is that, if Jesus was fully human, then all the human qualities are there, including the ability to laugh. And there's a lot of funny stories in the Bible if we read them that way. And we look for that. And you have to remember, 12 guys walking around together, there's going to be some ribbing of each other. One of the things Bob points to is we've got two instances where Peter tries to walk on water, and both times he fails. And he does it for a little bit and then sinks. And can you imagine what his friends must have said after that? I mean, in John 21, which I talked about last time, after that happens, Jesus fishes them out and then goes and makes breakfast for everybody. And I'm sure a topic of discussion there was how funny it was when Peter went under. The book of Peter, 1 Peter, that we read from today, most theologians and historians don't think it was written by Peter the Apostle, that it was someone later writing in his person. But I do think that there's things in there that are just joyful and hopeful. And listen to the way the words roll. And remember, he's talking to outcasts, to aliens and exiles, as they're described. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That's about joy. That's about embodiment. There's an exclamation mark after mercy. And there probably always should be an exclamation mark after mercy. It's a remarkable thing. Yesterday, my dad and I went down to the Eastern Market, and went to a diner and had lunch with this guy named Danny Harani. And Danny did something remarkable. He got in a lot of trouble when he was 19 years old. He was involved in heroin trafficking, very serious crime. He did 28 years, I think, for that crime. He, during that time, reformed himself in a remarkable way. He got a college degree from Indiana State. He started programs for the other prisoners. He was the person, and I've had this experience, when you walk into a prison and you talk to the warden says, this is the guy who should get out, that he was the guy. Judge Friedman eventually agreed, and he was released, I believe, in 2020. Now, here's the thing about Danny that people wouldn't know from that biography. Probably 2014, he wrote to me, and he asked, can you help me with clemency? I think I deserve a shot at a commutation of my sentence, a shortening of the sentence. And that's what I do at school with my students. We have a clinic where we do exactly that work. And I wrote back to him and said, no, as I so often have to tell people. In his case, it was because I was a federal prosecutor in the office that prosecuted him at the time he was prosecuted, which was a bar to helping him. You'd expect resentment when you say no or something like that, but something else happened. He started writing to me, and every couple weeks I get a note from Danny Harani encouraging me in helping other people, not him. That's a remarkable thing. I mean, that is where the grace, the mercy was reversed. That it's my job to find mercy for people like Danny. But it completely inverted once I said no. He didn't let me go. He wrote and wrote and wrote. Before we met, I pulled up some of the messages that I got from him. And it is a remarkable thing. And I'll tell you this, that when I saw him for the first time, I'd never seen him in person, outside of Zeff's down by Eastern Market, that was joy. That was a moment of joy and a remarkable thing. Once you had not received mercy, but now you've received mercy. We all have moments of joy if we allow them. And sometimes, Danny said, sometimes I just feel so happy when I'm driving the car. And I do too. There's these other moments that relate to different things. When our son John was born, being there at the hospital and having my parents come and telling my dad, we're naming him John. And my dad said, you're naming him after my dad? And that was a moment of pure joy for a lot of reasons. Often when someone else is happy, that brings us joy. My cousin Elizabeth is here this morning, and she just returned from a trip to Scotland. Epic trip. And she did a thing that was an act of grace for all of us who know her, which is she posted all these pictures of places I've never been and probably never will go to that were beautiful and exotic and different. And I could tell from what she wrote and the pictures that she took, the joy that she was taking and what she was getting to do. And that brought me joy too. I have a colleague at work, and she was going through some hard times, a person of faith. And she said, when you think of God, how do you feel? And I said, well, you go first. How do you feel? And she said, I feel fear. I just feel fear. But I can tell you don't. Why, how is that? And it's true. When I think of God or I feel the presence of God, I don't feel fear. I feel joy. And maybe there's a connection there. Maybe both are necessary. Perhaps I should feel more fear and less joy. But I think part of it too is letting yourself not be in charge. If we're controlling the relationship with God, we're not letting God be God. If when what we fear is that God won't give us what we want, then who's really in charge? I feel sometimes like the relationship with God is more like surfing. The good wave comes, you ride on top of it, your heart soars, you fall down, your face scrubs the sand at the bottom of the beach. And it's all part of a whole. But we didn't create the wave. We didn't create the beach. We didn't create the sand. Again, the historical Peter was somebody that when you read the stories in the gospel about Peter, he's somebody who just, he had an earthiness to him that is really wonderful. And he reacted, that sense of him jumping out of the boat and trying to run across the water to Jesus, that's who he was. He thought he could do it, and he did for a little bit. And he had this devotion to Jesus that was really remarkable. Now, a lot of times people will say, well, he denied Jesus 3 times. I'll tell you, as a criminal lawyer, I've got a different understanding of that. You have to remember that the person who asked Peter if he knew Jesus was Caiaphas' servant girl, the prosecutor. And what was happening in the trial of Jesus is that the witnesses were all conflicting. They didn't agree. He was having trouble putting his case together. And so he sends the servant girl out to get more witnesses. Now, the thing about Peter is that if he had appeared as a witness, he would have been what we used to call in my U.S. Attorney's office a blurt. That is someone who just blurts everything out. Because that's the kind of person he was. And it would have been bad for Jesus because the things he would have blurted would have all been what Caiaphas was looking for to condemn him about being the Son of God. I used to do this exercise of the trial of Jesus. And we did it once at my school. And one of the witnesses was Peter. And I was the prosecutor. I was Caiaphas. That's my background. I was comfortable doing that. And so I'm cross-examining Peter. And there was a student named Phil Steger who played Peter, and he was great. I remember he showed up. We're getting ready to do the trial, and he's wearing a hoodie. And I'm like, Phil, we've got the trial in 5 minutes. Are you going to dress up? And he's like, no, I'm a fisherman. This is what I'd wear. And he was completely in character already, and I knew I was in trouble. Now, he was a terrible witness for Jesus, because every time I said, and he said that the temple will fall, and Phil would say, as Peter, he did, the master said that, it was incredible. And so a bad witness, but an enthusiastic and joy-filled disciple. He was recruited out of a boat. Think about that. A guy comes to you while you're fishing and says, drop everything, leave your family, and just follow me, and he does it? That's a pretty remarkable act of faith. At the Transfiguration, we see God and Moses and Elijah appear, and Peter's there. Jesus brought him up. And Peter's reaction is, it's the Feast of Sukkot, where they build huts. And Peter says, I'll go build huts for them. Now, that Elijah needed a hut for Sukkot was pretty funny. I'm sure that within the Jewish tradition, Peter's reaction of, I'll build you a hut was pretty funny. I think one mistake that people make is this, and I know I have, and that is connecting the idea of joy to power or to accomplishment. If you think back on some of your greatest accomplishments, sometimes there's a joylessness to it. And the joy comes at other moments when we don't have power or accomplishment. I'll never forget winning my first trial as a prosecutor. And the jury came back and said guilty. And the guy looked down, and the defense attorney consoled him. And I thought I'd feel great. I won. And I didn't. Because the whole thing was wreathed in tragedy, as criminal law always is. And then there's this, that sometimes I think keeps people away from joy. It's that sense of insignificance, that we're one of 6 billion people on the earth, that in the end we'll be here and be gone. And that's something we all have to deal with. But I love the passage that was read this morning, which is this. All flesh is like grass, in all its glory the flower of grass. The grass withers and the flower dies, but the word of the Lord endures forever. All flesh is like grass. We used to drive down I-35 from Lake Saganaga up in Canada down to Waco, Texas. And on the way there are the Flint Hills. It's the old tall grass prairie, one of the few places that still exists. It's a beautiful, stark place. Almost treeless. Just waves of grass. It's rolling hills covered with this tall grass, uniform. And it's overwhelmingly beautiful. Every year, it's an ecosystem that relies on fire to regenerate. That the grass withers, fire comes through, it comes up the next year. And yeah, we're that blade of grass, one of the blades of grass. But what a wonderful thing to be part of something that beautiful, that overwhelming. That is joy-filled. It's not insignificant, because each of us is loved. Each of those blades of grass is what makes up that whole that we see. And that is the highest calling we have, is to be one of them and to know that. And it's glorious to be a leaf of grass, to be that part of God's creation, and to be part of the soul of a church that endures each death and still survives and is still beautiful. Amen. All right. Questions? Yes?
Who managed your lunchmates' convocation?
More than anybody, he got compassionate release ultimately from Judge Friedman, so he didn't get clemency. He did it himself, as a lot of the people who do, they do it themselves. And one thing, too, that I have to be careful to say is that I never say that I got somebody clemency. They always got it themselves. I get to help tell the story, but they have to live the story. I mean, this is a guy who for 28 years didn't have a single disciplinary issue. That's remarkable, given the number of fights and problems. And he was at a maximum security prison in Terre Haute for much of it. And so, he lived it. Now, it had to be argued in court, and his defense attorney came back and did that and did a really good job. But like most of the people who are successful, whether I work with them or not, the person who gets it is themselves. Now, he happens to be a really good storyteller. And that's what's at the heart of getting clemency for people. And if you think about it, clemency is a form of mercy. And any kind of mercy, it comes from storytelling. It comes from someone knowing the whole story. I mean, think about the number of times you've been able to forgive someone who wronged you after they finally broke down and told you why they did it and what they were feeling. That sense of being able to tell the story is really essential. And the people who are successful are the ones who both live it and are able to tell that story themselves. Other questions? Yes? Yeah.
Something he said struck me, is that he was given a life sentence without parole. No one, including his parents, thought he would ever be released. There was only one person who thought he would be released, and that was Andy.
Yep.
And he said that he was in prison when he could not see out into the outside world. And so there was nothing to look forward to, except he believed in
Yeah.
God.
And since we don't have a mic, I'm going to repeat what my dad just said, because it's important. And it plays into your last question, too, which is that my dad was at lunch with Danny yesterday. And part of what Danny said was that no one else thought he was going to get out. His family thought he was going to be in prison for the rest of his life. He had a life without parole sentence. That he had, the person who gave him hope was himself and his belief that something could happen. He talked about the design of the prison, that they had reconfigured the prison in Terre Haute so that instead of looking out a window and seeing the outside world, you saw another wall of the prison. So they intentionally reconfigured what people could see so they couldn't see what to hope for. And that, even, despite that obstacle, he was able to have hope and to give hope to other people too. So, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so the question is prison good or bad? We hear about the extremes when there's a terrible experience or one that's really necessary, but what about the majority of people? And that's an excellent question. There's those who want to abolish all prisons. I'm not one of them. Most of the people I know who have been in prison, and because of what I do, I know a lot of people who have been in prison, most of them aren't prison abolitionists. They think there's people that should be in there. And some of them also will say that the first part of the time I was in prison was really important. I had to get out of the life that I was living, and it gave me that chance. Now, it could have been a less harsh environment for doing that, but in terms of almost everybody who goes to prison isn't like Danny. They're not doing life, and so they are going to come back out. Unfortunately, you're talking about the majority of people, they come out, they haven't really gotten anything out of it. They haven't gotten a trade, they may have gotten some education. Danny was talking about how few people even get a GED though. And then they re-enter society and they're here with us. There's this real tension between wanting to punish people by making it really difficult to be in prison, and on the other hand, rehabilitating them so that when they come out, which they usually do, they can be productive citizens. Now, for some types of crimes, we have really high rates of recidivism, unfortunately. And that's a lot of those people in the middle, because the people in the extreme, they're going to continue to be incarcerated. People don't stop living when they go to prison, and if there are people who still have really bad intent, they're going to get in trouble in prison too, and they're going to commit crimes within the prison and get caught and things like that, and they'll be there for a long time. But those people in the middle, unfortunately, it's all punishment for too many of them. And again, I'm not a prison abolitionist. There probably are people in prison that I sent there that I'm fine with that still. But that doesn't mean that the way we're doing it is producing a good for us all. That because we've gone so far towards the punishment, we have lost too much of the essence of what's necessary to have people come back in a state where they can work, where they can do what Danny's doing. Now, he pursued it relentlessly. He wanted to be one of those people that came out and was very different, even though he had no real hope of getting out. And we need more people like him, and to find ways to have that happen even as they're being punished. So, question?
So can you clarify what
Uh,
and how it's clemency and why it's happened.
Yeah, okay, so the question is about compassionate release, and that's a good question, and how it's different than clemency. Clemency goes to the President of the United States in the federal system, and in most states it goes to the governor or to a board. Compassionate release is something that is statutory. Clemency is in the Constitution, and it's the pardon power of the president. Compassionate release is within a statute. I think it's 18 U.S.C. 3582. Not that you need to know the citation. But what it allows for is for people to be released early, and largely it's people who are elderly or have medical issues, and sometimes because of extraordinary circumstances. And what happened was that it was entirely up to the Bureau of Prisons to allow for compassionate release. And for decades, the Bureau of Prisons hardly recommended anybody for compassionate release. People who were 93 years old were dying in prison, having served 48 years, and it wasn't really serving any purpose. In 2018, President Trump signed a bill called the First Step Act. One of the things the First Step Act did was broaden compassionate release so that prisoners could, if they were denied by the BOP, they could go to court and pursue it. And that's what Danny did. And in fact, the DOJ opposed his release, but he prevailed in front of Judge Friedman. And his attorney on that was Steve Fishman, who's a prominent defense attorney in this area. So, okay, well, probably, oh, I'm sorry, yes?
I recently met somebody who was involved in the Innocence Project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the Innocence Program, Innocence Project is a national program. It was co-founded by a guy named Barry Scheck, who I've worked with. And it really, for a long time, was focused on DNA, using DNA to exonerate people who had been convicted of crimes where there was DNA evidence still available. And now they've moved on to other types of cases. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as wrongful conviction as opposed to innocence, because without DNA, it's hard to prove definitively that someone is innocent. Now, people often ask me, so you work with the Innocence Project? And I tell them, no, I work with the Guilty Project, because the people that we take for clemency are people who are willing to say, I did that. I repent for the harm that I've done, which is, in a way, for me, it's a fuller spiritual exercise and vocation. So, all right, well, thank you all, and thank you so much for having me back.